Anyway, well, welcome. We have a lot of students here tonight, which is very good, but we also have some other guests here, so and I'm happy to see that. And we're bringing in some people that are viewing this on Zoom. So at the end of this, I think we want to try to incorporate them as well. Steve and I aren't the greatest at doing this, but we're figuring it out. Or you're better than I, but you left me in charge on the thing. So, but anyway, just a couple things before we get started here. Dr. Grabar will be talking probably about 35, 40 minutes, and then after that, I just want to reassure everybody we'll open it up for question and answer. I think we'll start the questions just because of our technical inabilities. First with questions here, and we'll go around the room there. Then we're going to open it up, so those people who are on Zoom, if you in turn want to provide a question, you can do so through the chat, and we have somebody who will be monitoring that. And so after we finish the questions here, then we'll go to the chat and see what questions we have there, and we'll have someone reading those to us, so that'll be the second level. And then finally, there is a hand signal, so if we want to open it up on Zoom for anybody who has a hand signal, we'll do that, and we'll see if that works on the thing. So, but it's very nice to have our speaker here for a change. We've been doing so many Zoom talks, it's nice to be in present. And the other nice thing is to be able to take your mask off when you get up here, so you can welcome that as well on the thing. Just a little bit about our speaker tonight. Dr. Grabar was born in Slovenia, and we have at least some Yugoslavian background here as well on the thing. But she was born there when it was Yugoslavia. She and her family moved from Yugoslavia. I guess it was back several years, but she, as a young child, she moved to the United States, and I guess lived in the New York area, if that's correct on the thing, in the Rochester area. She has a PhD in English from the University of Georgia, and she has taught and been a professor around the Georgia area at Emory University. And recently she has been a fellow at the Alexander Hamilton Institute for the Study of Western Civilization, if I got that correctly on the thing, so I did good on that. So as a research fellow, I would describe she is, I think the word prolific writer is a fair description. She's probably most known for her work on the debunking of Howard Zinn, and I think that it's a controversial book, no question, but again, it's a well-documented book, so she's known for that. But she's also been the author, there's Bill Ayers' Teaching Revolution, A New Begin, or Revised Past. It's about Barack Obama during his Cairo visit. She's also written for the Weekly Standard, the American Thinker, CNN News, Town Hall, and other publications. And she also has published as a poet and as a fictional writer. So I think when you put all that together, that in turn makes you a prolific writer in our scores on the thing. Just a word on her book, the Debunking of Howard Zinn. It is indeed controversial, but if you read the praises of the book, and albeit these are praises coming more from the conservative side and the conservative press, but I think they give you a feel of the book itself and its impact on the thing. So just to quote, for example, the Federalist notes that with nearly 1,000 footnotes, Grabar quite clearly and conclusively documents that Zinn is not only a plagiarist but a liar. And I know that's very profound, but it tells you the impact that this book is in turn having, at least in terms of the conservative audience. Another author writes that Mary Grabar has produced and demonstrated analysis of the lies and plagiarisms and violations of academic standards that characterizes Zinn's proper history. Now, when you take that into account and then you think of the dominance of the book, it certainly merits its attention. Whether you agree or disagree, it merits that particular attention. And that's why we thought it was important to bring someone like her on campus on the thing. Just another, and this is more on a personal note, but as an academic, I'm an economist, and I have spent 40 years in the academic circles, and I know the scholarly output that comes out and where it's formed. And I've looked at one hand, you could look at Keynesian economists on the one hand, you could then look at MIT and Samuelson and the people who go on that position. You could look at the University of Chicago and Milton Friedman, and you can see this debate that has been going on in the academic disciplines for 40 or 50 years. I had the benefit of going to a graduate school where I had, on the one hand, I had an economist, Brian Motley. And Brian Motley was London School of Economics and Keynesian and neo-Keynesian. And Steve knows Stuart Greenbaum. And Stuart Greenbaum taught me monetary economics, and then he would drive up once a month to Milton Friedman's workshops. And I can't tell you the benefit that I received from looking at both those particular positions. And as an academic of 40 years, I cherish that. Okay? And that's true of all disciplines, and that's what we are here. We, in turn, will throw out debates, controversy, and we debate those particular arguments. And I wanted to share that with you. And I want to share that basically in the name of truth, that we don't know the truth, but what we try to do is pursue the truth. And maybe in the end, then we get a better handle on that. And so I'll leave you with two thoughts here, and then I'm going to turn it over to Mary here on the thing. But first of all, think a little bit about, if I'm thinking of Slovenia, I think of Václav Havel, who was the late president of the Czech Republic. And when it was communism and he was a playwright, he in turn talked about what was turning the country away from communism. And his point was that when he would go to people, they started to look at the area and they just got tired of not living in the truth. And he has a famous quote that I'll give you here. It says, "Keep the company of those who seek the truth, run from those who have found it." And the other thought I'll give you as I bring up Mary here is, we can go back to 1984, we can go to George Orwell. If you haven't read that book, read that book at some point. And it's a world in which they've erased history. And one of the famous quotes there is, "He who controls the past controls the future. He who controls the present controls the past." And so it's very important to us as academics to maintain that discourse, that questioning back and forth of history, to try to get to the truth, to seek the truth. Okay. So with that, it's my pleasure to welcome Mary Grabar here. And so with that, will you join me in bringing up Mary Grabar? So. And you can take your mask off.
Oh, yeah. One thing I find about these masks is my glasses always fog up. I hate it. But anyway, it's great to be here finally, after several months of planning and going back and forth. And so I'm so happy to see so many copies of my book out there and that you've read them. And so I'm going to be directing my comments more, not so much on the specifics of what Howard Zinn writes and how I debunk what he writes, but more on some background. And so I was told that many of you have read Hayek, and that inspired me to revisit The Road to Serfdom. And I really got into it, and I almost started writing another book. It was so fascinating, and it was a very good suggestion, and I'm grateful for it. So I'm going to try to weave that all together. Also, a little bit of my background and what's the history of the displaced persons from Slovenia. There's a whole story there. I, of course, came long after the war, not really that long. But, 1945, there was a mass exodus, and in a lot of the Eastern European countries, there were horrors to behold that really aren't talked about these days or taught about. So I'm going to begin with one of my favorite writers, Richard Pipes. He's the late historian of Russia. In his concise book, Communism, A History, begins, "The idea of a classless, fully egalitarian society first emerged in classical Greece. Ancient Greece happened to have been the first country in the world to recognize private property in land and to treat land as a commodity. And hence it was the first to confront the social inequalities that result from ownership. End of quote. The theme of the Golden Age, back when there was no shameful lust for gain, resounded in the writings of the Greek and Roman poets, and then Pipes writes, in the Republic, speaking through Socrates, Plato saw the root of discord and war in belongings. Aristotle, however, questioned whether such a communist utopia would bring about social peace. He argued that social discord arises not from material belongings, but in the, quote, yearning for them. In the Old Testament, I believe this is called covetousness. The myth of the Golden Age continued in European consciousness. The Indians in the Americas were thought to be living the dream, but in the encounter with reality, realistic appraisals came out. The dream of a property-less society still lives on, but as Pipes points out, property equals survival. Even animals protect their territory in order to survive, to have enough to eat. When a central planning agency comes in and tries to tell you what to do with your property, your very life is at stake. This was the experience of my relatives who lived under Tito's brutal regime in Slovenia after World War II. Many of you are probably far removed from farming, especially the subsistence farming of peasants in Europe, as my family were. But as I recall from visiting there when I was 12 in 1969 with my family, food is a big deal. As in America, hog slaughtering done in late fall was a big production, taking all day. But under Tito, my relatives had to engage in midnight hog slaughtering because they were slaughtering a hog that was over the quota. I don't know how they hid these hogs from the communist inspectors, but I also know that when hogs are slaughtered, they make a lot of noise. But around midnight, the communist inspectors were far away from the mud and straw thatched houses of my relatives in their comfortable homes. And that's when men who wanted to feed their families slaughtered the extra hog. Most of the young people who today in a majority favor socialism over capitalism, as surveys show, have probably never heard such stories or know much about communism in practice. A lot of that has to do with the way history is taught and the most influential history book since 1980, 40 years ago when it was first published, and this, of course, is Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. In the 1930s, thinkers on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean were warning about the developments in communist countries and the slide into socialism in the United States and England. Here in the United States, we were experiencing the Great Depression and the growth of big government under President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. We were also eyeing what was going on in Europe. There was increased starvation and purging under the Soviet Union and the growth of fascism in Germany. I understand that many of you have read F.A. Hayek, who was frustrated by the common conflation of capitalism with Nazism. Hayek correctly saw the two systems, fascism and communism, as socialistic variants of totalitarianism. He traced the problem back to planning, economic planning, something Roosevelt imagined he could do to get us out of the Depression, but it actually prolonged it. An American writer, H.L. Mencken, was also observing, and he, like his black conservative friend George Schuyler, was calling FDR a dictator. I'm not sure if any of you have read Mencken, but if you haven't, you should. As James Weldon Johnson said, everyone should read Mencken in order to clear the cobwebs out of their brains. In the magazine he had co-founded, the American Mercury, H.L. Mencken published such trenchant critiques as the New Deal mentality, the dole for bogus farmers, and a constitution for the New Deal. In his piece titled The Dole for Bogus Farmers, Mencken pointed his economic critiques at the farm program, which he called a philanthropic but fruitless work on behalf of mendicants, land speculators, and, quote, one-crop clodhoppers. In A Constitution for the New Deal, he explained that a new constitution is needed because of the conflict between the swift-moving idealism of the New Deal and the unyielding hunkerousness of the Constitution proclaimed in 1788. And the Constitution was lagging far behind the views of forward-looking men. In the New Deal mentality, men can trace the New Deal back to its roots, to the collectivism in Russia being latched onto by FDR's brain trust. These men were members of what Mencken called the I am not a communist, but dash club. The idea of this club, Mencken said, seems to be to enjoy all the solaces of the Marxian communion without actually submitting to baptism. This club was indeed religious in nature. As he wrote, there is the same innocent acceptance of the obviously not true, the same touching confidence in an often postponed day of judgment, and the same shrill impatience with dissenters. Mencken continued, the comrades have restored heresy to its old high place among the crimes and misdemeanors. The comrades, he continued, have borrowed their whole bag of tricks from the theologians. The New Deal belongs to the same category. It, too, is a kind of religion, though somewhat cheaper and less sophisticated than the variety propagated from Moscow. Over in England, F.A. Hayek was making similar observations, but not in such salty language, of course. Notably, in an essay, Planning Away Our Liberty, published in 1938. This, along with another essay titled Freedom and the Economic System, became the basis for The Road to Serfdom. Hayek, too, noted the similarity between many of the most characteristic features of fascist and communist regimes, and it was in planning. He went on to note in his essay that the dictatorial direction cannot remain confined to economic matters, but is bound to expand and to become totalitarian in the strict sense of the word. The economic dictator will soon find himself forced, even against his wishes, to assume dictatorship over the whole of the political and cultural life of the people. Like Mencken, he saw it as a system of belief, and I'll read you a passage from Hayek. The inevitable distinction between persons must be made a distinction of rank, most conveniently and naturally based on the degree to which people share and loyally support the creed of the ruler. And it further clarifies the position if to the aristocracy of creed at one end of the scale there corresponds a class of outcasts at the other, whose interests can in all cases be sacrificed to those of the privileged class. The class of outcasts are those who refuse to adhere to the creed and refuse to have their lives planned by others who think of themselves as their betters. They are not deemed fit for engagement or conversation or even jobs. What they say or write is to be regardless of the quality of what they say. They should not be allowed to teach. And they are often ipso facto racists and fascists. Support, however, needs to be built up for this view to become commonplace. And Hayek says the devotion to the creed must be exacted from everybody. He continues, the creation and enforcement of the common creed and of the belief in the supreme wisdom of the ruler becomes an indispensable instrument for the success of the planned system. And here is a key sentence. The ruthless use of all potential instruments of propaganda and the suppression of every expression of dissent is not an accidental accompaniment of a centrally directed system. It's an essential part of it. This is from chapter 11 of The Road to Serfdom, titled The End of Truth. And I think truth was mentioned in the opening comments. In the opening paragraph of this chapter, Hayek again uses that word creed. He writes about the necessity to make the people believe in the same ends that the rulers dictate. They should come to regard them as their own ends and their own beliefs. And he also writes, although the beliefs must be chosen for the people and imposed upon them, they must become their beliefs, a generally accepted creed which makes the individuals as far as possible act spontaneously in the way the planner wants. To act spontaneously in the way the planner wants. This, of course, is achieved through propaganda. Furthermore, collectivism demands a new moral code. What Hayek says is an authoritarian determination of the status of each individual in the new hierarchical order, which means that most of the humanitarian elements of our morals, the respect for human life, for the weak and for the individual generally, will disappear. But the moral consequences of totalitarian propaganda are of an even more profound kind. They are destructive of all morals because they undermine one of the foundations of all morals, the sense of and respect for the truth. Hayek discusses the changes also in definitions of words, the use of old words with new meanings to persuade people that they are values that they have long held dear. He writes, facts and theories must thus become no less the object of an official doctrine than views about values, and the whole apparatus for spreading knowledge, the schools and the press, radio and motion picture, will be used exclusively to spread those views which, whether true or false, will strengthen the belief in the rightness of the decisions taken by the authority, and all information that might cause doubt or hesitation will be withheld. This systematic control of information applies to all fields, even the most remote from any political interests. In those disciplines dealing directly with human affairs and therefore most immediately affecting political views, such as history, law, or economics, the disinterested search for truth cannot be allowed. The disinterested pursuit of truth cannot be allowed. These disciplines, he writes, have indeed in all totalitarian countries become the most fertile factories of the official myths which the rulers use to guide the minds and wills of their subjects. Which brings me to Howard Zinn. Howard Zinn was born in 1922 and was a teenager in the late 1930s when Mencken and Hayek were writing. Zinn grew up in Brooklyn with his three brothers and parents, Russian Jewish immigrants. In the late 1930s, in the time of Hayek's and Mencken's writings that I mentioned, Zinn was a teenager being recruited by the communists coming into his neighborhood. As he wrote in his autobiography, they had opened his eyes to what he claims is fundamentally wrong with America. He then served in World War II and became a member of the Communist Party from about 1948 to 53. In 1956, he was hired by Spelman College, where he radicalized students, turning them against the administration and their country. As a good communist, he dropped his official membership in order to infiltrate the institutions. At Spelman, though, he was fired for insubordination, fought it, and was threatened with a morals charge, but was soon hired by Boston University, where he continued to do the same thing, now using the Vietnam War instead of civil rights as a cover for radicalization. He got down to writing his magnum opus after a 4-month stint teaching in Paris. He said that he was able to write it in record time due to the historical knowledge he had acquired during 20 years of teaching. That was hardly the case, for Zinn wrote nothing that can be deemed scholarly after his dissertation. And as I show in my book, and some of you may have read this, the first 5.5 pages are plagiarized from a book for high school students written by a fellow radical novelist. And what little Zinn does quote from Columbus is in a misleading manner, and these strategies permeate the book. Zinn came at the right time for his mission because the practice of history was being changed in the late 1960s. The disinterested pursuit of truth was being abandoned for having an agenda for activism. And so he was able, because of the timing, to push forward his book, and it became popular. But Zinn went beyond what his fellow radicals, his younger colleagues did. He basically updated the book written by William Z. Foster, chairman of the Communist Party USA, which came out in 1951. Zinn develops his propaganda in two ways. First, he presents distorted facts. Then he justifies the distortion, persuading the reader to abandon his abilities or his rationality for sentiment. In terms of factual distortions, there are some real doozies in Zinn's book, as you may recall, that the United States is the most racist place in the world, that women had the status of slaves, communists were the only ones who cared about blacks, the Japanese Americans were put in prison conditions in camps and a close duplication of fascism hidden far away, that communist movements in Europe, the Philippines, China, and Vietnam were homegrown democracy movements, that we were in Vietnam because we were imperialists. Historians on the left and the right see such claims as outlandish lies. And I have no problem with left-wing historians. In fact, I quote from several of them in my book to refute Zinn. I do have a problem with manipulating the evidence and using deceptive emotional appeals, which is what Zinn does, and quite deliberately. The first official myth is about Columbus. Zinn claimed that Christopher Columbus was motivated by capitalist greed to enslave, rape, and murder the native Arawaks. The myth was stolen from Hans Koning, from whom Zinn plagiarized. But this propaganda had been long promoted by communists. Friedrich Engels, in his 1847 speech, The Discovery of America, claimed that Columbus's discovery led to the, quote, struggle of the propertyless against the property owners. And it was repeated by Foster. Columbus, according to this myth, brought capitalism to a veritable Garden of Eden, where natives had lived in harmony with nature without war, hunger, oppression, or sexism. Zinn was writing in the sensibility of the 1960s, so his Indian is more like a hippie. He is a usable Indian, as another scholar has categorized it. He is usable to Zinn's purposes, but he is stereotyped, and Zinn's presentation of the over 500 tribes lumped together is an insult. The other aspect has to do with Zinn making this propaganda convincing. On page 7, after presenting Columbus as being like Hitler, and before the reader can pause to wonder if one man could be capable of committing so many atrocities, Zinn goes into a rant. And this is how he begins. Thus began the history 500 years ago of the European invasion of the Indian settlements in the Americas. Zinn then declares that the very beginning was conquest, slavery, death. He then goes on to attack what children had been taught in their history books, that it starts with heroic adventure and Columbus Day is a celebration. He attacks the best-known authority on Columbus, Samuel Eliot Morison, accusing him of burying the fact of genocide in his 1954 book, Christopher Columbus Mariner. And this genocide, but however, this genocide was due largely to the introduction of diseases and the actions of some of the Spanish who disobeyed Columbus also after Columbus had left the scene. Zinn is on a crusade to denounce Morison as an apologist for the capitalist class. The next 4 pages Inserted in the first chapter is an emotionally charged denunciation of the United States from its discovery to the present. Zinn tells us that we are falsely attached to the pretense that there really is such a thing as, scare quotes, the United States, subject to occasional conflicts and quarrels, but fundamentally a community of people with common interests, as if there really is a national interest represented in the Constitution, in territorial expansion, in the laws passed by Congress, the decision of the courts, the development of capitalism, the culture of education, and mass media. So there is nothing unifying us, he says. We are not the United States. Now that the reader believes that he has had his eyes opened and has been stirred to outrage over how this truth has been long hidden from him and suppressed by a once esteemed historian, Morrison, he is primed for Zinn's thesis about American history. The treatment of heroes, Columbus, and their victims, the Arawaks, the quiet acceptance of conquest and murder in the name of progress, is only one aspect of a certain approach to history in which the past is told from the point of view of governments, conquerors, diplomats, leaders. It is as if they, like Columbus, deserve universal acceptance, as if they, the founding fathers, Jackson, Lincoln, Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy, the leading members of Congress, the famous justices of the Supreme Court, represent the nation as a whole. And then the sentence that comes after is about the United States being a pretense. We are only on page 9, and yet Zinn has poisoned the well for the figures that come later in American history. Columbus and Zinn's conspiratorial presentation has set the stage, and from that point on, the United States, presented in scare quotes, is irredeemably infused with racism, sexism, xenophobia, and oppression, and all can be traced back to capitalists and capitalism. The solution for Zinn is to overthrow the government, because everything that's been tried has not worked in the way that he presents his history. While Zinn has long been criticized for his anti-Americanism, no one had systematically gone through his book to expose the falsehoods and the tricks he used. I thought that might count for something, and I was really surprised. I thought this was, going to be more of an anti-American screed, and I'd be analyzing it for the rhetoric, but I found so many errors that I was even shocked. Well, I thought my colleagues on the left would at least acknowledge what I had uncovered, that this is shoddy history. Many had been critical of Zinn themselves, but no such thing, as was the case with Mitch Daniels, who had quoted leftist professors' criticisms of Zinn to make his argument for removing the book from schools that received state funding. This was back in 2010 when Daniels was governor of Indiana. These very same critics of Zinn turned around and defended Zinn. When this was revealed in 2013, by which time Daniels was president of Purdue, the professors attacked Daniels himself. Their position is that anyone who disagrees with them politically should have no right to comment. They were protecting their status as clerics, keepers of the creed. Among these were Georgetown professor Michael Kazin and Stanford professor Sam Weinberg, who had strongly criticized Zinn. But what they were saying, though, is we know Zinn has falsified history, but no one, or at least Mitch Daniels, should not object to the use of his book in classrooms. Well, I guess I should not have been surprised by the reaction I got in response to my presentation at the White House Conference on American History this Constitution Day, where in my given 5 minutes I described how Zinn's, quote, fake history based on falsified evidence, misquotations with critical words left out, and plagiarized disreputable sources had led to a popular conception of the United States as irredeemably corrupt and deserving of violent overthrow, and I thought inspiring many people to act out in that way. A Michael Leroy Oberg, a distinguished professor of history, at SUNY Geneseo immediately tweeted, "On that stage, you'll see frightened white people, afraid of free inquiry and expression of having their beloved hashtag white supremacist hierarchy challenged in any way. This is fascism." End of tweet. Well, Ben Carson who was leading the panel discussion, might not think of himself as a frightened white person. And when I tried to engage the distinguished professor by asking which parts of my book were wrong, or pointed out that Native Americans were also engaged in warfare and slavery, he just continued to call me a fascist and a racist. So much for free inquiry. L.D. Burnett, a historian also, and a writer for Slate magazine, cleverly opened her article about the conference with, "From sea to shining sea, historians across the U.S. were doing shots of whiskey, mixing stiff cocktails, and binge-eating chocolates in the middle of the day. Not to celebrate any sudden interest of our fellow citizens in learning about the American past, but to fortify ourselves, to watch the White House Conference on American History." She joined her colleagues, called me Proud Mary, and claimed that I was not up to the culture wars, which some of my old professors from the 90s said were over. Apparently, they have the power, their creed is to be obeyed. People sometimes ask why I wrote my book. It was not what I envisioned doing when I pursued my PhD in English. I thought I would be explaining the difference between Elizabethan and Petrarchan sonnets to a class of rapt college students. Writing about Zen was not a pleasant task. In fact, I often felt like Mike Rowe doing a dirty job. Some of you might remember Dirty Jobs when my son used to have it on, and I'd be watching, and here's this guy emerging from a septic tank or something, and he's like got suspicious brown stuff all over him, and it's like, and I felt the same way when I was going through Zin's book. I felt like I needed a shower after I read some of his pages. But it was a job that needed to be done. However, unlike Mike Rowe, I was not making a reality show for television. Communism is a deadly reality. It was a deadly reality for others born in the same country I was born in, Slovenia. The latest issue of the Slovenian American Times, the scaled-back version of the newspaper my late mother subscribed to from Cleveland, has started a series of first-person accounts of Slovenians who came here as displaced persons after World War II. This month's account was written by Marie Jupan Bergar about her parents' experience when Slovenia was overrun by the fascists. She writes, "The Nazi oppression suffered by much of Europe was further complicated by a brutal and merciless communist insurgency. Mistrust was pervasive, and violence and murder quickly followed." End of her quote. Yes, that is what communists do. They try to sow discord, lack of unity. They did it in every place they took power. They had to start civil wars. When Tito took power in 1945, and this is Marie continuing, Catholics and anti-communists were labeled as traitors and falsely denounced as Nazi collaborators. Extrajudicial killings and political reprisals by the new regime filled over 600 mass graves with over 100,000 unfortunate souls. Now, this is in a tiny country. Slovenia is the size of New Jersey, which I believe is smaller than the state of Ohio. So just imagine driving along the road, and you don't know if in a cornfield or someplace there's a mass grave there. At the time, Marie's parents in 1945 were young adults, and they were still dating. But as she writes, there was no place for my parents to turn. My dad was once nearly shot by the Nazis because he was falsely accused of being a partisan, and those were the communists, of being a partisan spy. At the same time, communist partisans earmarked him for liquidation. End of her quote. Why? Well, because, as she continues, he was an influential businessman from a solid Catholic family, which alone was reason to be put to death by the communists before ever considering his anti-communist commitment. Her father and mother, on May 12, 1945, joined the 10-mile-long column of 30,000 people to the supposedly safe haven of Austria and British protection. The procession included 12,000 of the anti-communist village militias called Domobranci, or Home Guard, 6,000 civilians, retreating soldiers, and thousands of POWs of every nationality. Her parents were lucky, for they did not leave Austria with the group of 12,000 who had been told they were going to Italy, but were instead put in sealed train cars and sent to the partisans, where they were tortured and then rounded into huge pits where they were shot. Her parents remained in the refugee camp for 4 years until they were able to emigrate to America. Her father's family scattered to the US, Argentina, and Canada, which is typical. But his parents returned to a gutted home. The communists took over everything. Four of their sons were murdered by the regime. And I forgot to bring up the newspaper, but maybe later I can pass it around. But there is a photo of this long procession of people, 10 miles long, going through a tunnel. And there are a couple pages of where they are now excavating these mass graves, trying to identify the bones and to give these people decent burials. And among these things that were dug up by the archaeologists are personal possessions like crucifixes and medallions of the Virgin Mary and combs and personal items. So you may look at these pictures, but you no doubt have already seen such pictures of skeletons, of bones, of people who have been murdered by various regimes. Bones from Cambodians, African slaves, Polish Jews, Ukrainians, Armenians, Chinese, they all look the same. The same thing happened to African Americans who went to the Soviet Union. You can read about the horrific fate of the first black communist, Lovett Fort Whiteman, in an article I wrote on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, which was otherwise being celebrated on the campus of Hamilton College and other places. It's a guest column in the student publication of the AHI. It's called Enquiry, and it can be accessed at the ahi.org. But as Marie Burgar writes, this history is not being told. She is correct, sadly, it is not. It's not being told about Slovenia, nor much of the other countries oppressed by communist regimes. Instead, students are fed Zinn's fairy tales about happy communists. So I'd like to end with the title of Marie Burgar's essay is Our Exodus to Freedom, an Immigrant Odyssey, something that Howard Zinn would falsely dispute, but it was her odyssey to freedom, and I feel the same way. So thank you very much. Oh, stay up.
I'll stay down here and keep my mask down.
Okay.
Yeah, we want to now open it up for questions, so we'll try to take it from the floor. So Carson's in the back, so and kind of procedure, keep your mask on, and then he'll hold it close to you.
Thank you. Could you introduce yourself? I'm Dave Hess, and I'm a practicing gastroenterologist here in Cincinnati. But your story is very similar to my family. My mother, her grandparents actually were in Yugoslavia, and her grandparents died in a concentration camp, at that time. So when it hits home, it really is more personal, and you see what you were saying as far as the totalitarianism, how evil that is. And there's another good book out that I would recommend. You've probably read it, Live Not by Lies, by a man named Rod Dreher. And
okay.
he uses the line, which is from Solzhenitsyn, which says, live not by lies, which is what we were talking about before as far as truth. Mm-hmm. And he was saying the concern is that when you talk to older people, Czechoslovakian, Hungarians who have lived under this, he says, people here think it cannot happen here. But he says, this could very well go into a soft totalitarianism, like in China, the way that, the Chinese, the way they do surveillance, and how we're already getting into surveillance here. But, it's interesting because when you look at it for the young folks, when you look at like Twitter and what Google's doing, they are suppressing dialogue and conversation, and that's in some way a form of oppression of speech. And we have to guard against that. So your story hits home to me, and I really appreciate what you're doing. I really do. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Oh, yes. That's one of the most interesting parts of your talk was the question of disinformation, propaganda. And I know you sometimes you have the moniker online of the dissident professor.
Dissident prof, yes.
Dissident prof. So what is dissidency, and how does propaganda work? Why do people who know better buy into things that are not true? How does this happen?
Well, I call myself the dissident prof, and actually it's a nonprofit organization that took me 2 years to start. I had a $10,000 grant, and I got caught up in the IRS the IRS operation under the Obama administration, and was part of a class action lawsuit. So I was a dissident to the prevailing orthodoxy on campus. And your second question was about propaganda. Yeah, well, the way I see it with Zen, and I see him as a very skillful propagandist. I mean, it's not, if you read some of these old communist writings, they're so dreadfully boring. You can see why William Z. Foster's book never took off. I mean, it's like, they just pound it in. But Zen really knows how to appeal to emotions. And so his rhetorical strategy is very effective. He takes you into his confidence. It's almost like he's intimate with the reader, and he says, here, I'm going to tell you a secret. The other historians, the big giant, Samuel Eliot Morison, one of the giants of American history, Harvard, all kinds of awards, he's no one. I'm going to tell you this real secret history. And so then he kind of pretends to be exposing something new. Of course, he's lying. He's completely lying. And he also weaves in a lot of fiction and poetry, words that are intended to appeal to emotions. And my next book is going to be on the 1619 Project. And I've noticed that it's a 100-page magazine supplement, but it's like there's very little history in it. It's memoirs, it's poetry written for the occasion. And so I think Zen knows that people want to be thought of as being smart. He understands people psychologically. And those people tend to be young. They tend to be idealistic, naive, maybe not well-versed in history. And so he's very skillful in that way. As a matter of fact, I started writing a paper where I was comparing him. I did my master's thesis on Paradise Lost, and I started comparing him to Satan in the Garden of Eden with Eve. He actually uses the same rhetorical strategies. Kind of fascinating.
So as we're waiting on the chat here, we talked a little bit today about context, about the study of world history, and then putting the United States in that context of world history. Because if I take a narrow view of U.S. history, and that's my only context, you know, as I say, I grew up and I lived in Jim Crow South, or at least part of the South there, and I witnessed a lot of this. I could kind of see myself as being a white supremacist from that point of view. But I also saw the progress that has taken place since then, and I have a sense of world history that allows me to put the United States in that context. And I know in your book you do the same thing. You put history in context. And if you could comment on that, and maybe to the extent that Zen does or does not put that context there.
Yeah, that's a great point, because what Zen does, and I think it's the way American history is being treated, especially early part of American history, is treated in isolation, and the standard that we're matched against is not of other places in the world at the same time, but of this utopia of perfection. And there is no place in the world where they have reached perfection, and there never will be. And so it gives a very distorted view of what was going on. I mean, I'm reading one of the historians that Zen disparages, Bernard Bailyn. He's excellent, and it's a book called The Barbarous Age. And he describes what life was like in North America. You know, the first chapter is about what it was like before the settlers came to Jamestown. It was warfare. You know, the stereotype that Zen uses is just not true. And I think if we study history in that way, we can see that human beings have more in common than they have in terms of differences. There has been barbarity in every culture. You know, slavery has existed since the beginning of time. It existed among the Native American tribes. It's still going on, largely in Africa. And there is no place that lives the kind of lifestyle that Zen and the other communists present the Indians as living, that, you know, sort of in tune with nature, cooperative. Women are liberated, and there's no problems, not even in potty training. You know, it's all just, you know, kumbaya, and that's not the case. We're all human. We're all subject to, if I may use this on this campus, sin. You know, we're imperfect, and so any nationality, any group has those characteristics.
Yeah. How do we defend the truth and approach it disinterestedly when it is so popular to deny? Isn't that?
How do we defend truth?
Sorry. Okay. So how do we defend the truth and approach it disinterestedly when it is so popular to deny the mere existence of truth?
Well, you know, I guess you have to be willing to be hated by a lot of people and get nasty tweets, and I mean, that's what I've discovered, and you know, but I think the more we defend truth and try to defend it dispassionately, and say, you know, wait a minute, these are the facts, and I've noticed that, you know, very few, I don't know if anyone who's really engaged me on the facts. I've had several colleagues look through my manuscript and say, wait, you got this thing wrong, and I'd say, oh, thank you very much, you know, for pointing that out. But I think, you know, that's why Zen is so dangerous, and he is the kind of propaganda that accompanies this totalitarian mindset. I mean, his goal was to start a communist revolution in this country. I mean, if you read his book, you see I don't know how many of you have read his book, but if you see, every time he presents some kind of effort to get justice, and they're immediately, beaten down, and he's always got in the horizon communism, and communism is presented as, wonderful. It's even presented as wonderful in Vietnam, and totally, manipulates and transforms the words of Douglas Pike, who wrote the book about the Viet Cong. Very, very deliberate, very deceptive. And one of the reasons I wanted to write my book was that, and I think it's important, is because for so long, for 40 years, Zinn has just been promoted as having a different perspective, as writing a bottom-up history of the common people. And if you talk to the common people, like my late parents or your relatives, none of them wanted communism, and that's what Hayek also points out. The common people, workers, never are the ones agitating for communism unless they've somehow been manipulated by the intellectuals or the elites who are agitating for it. They want their little plot of land, no matter how small it is, and they don't want to go into a big collective farm or something. It's just human nature. So.
Yeah, thank you very much. When you were talking, you made reference to Africa twice. Mm-hmm. And I would like to find out, the first instance was, I think you talked when you were trying to trace egalitarianism to the Greeks. I'm just wondering, that idea, where did they get it from? Because you made reference to Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, and so on and so forth. Could you help us understand where they got those ideas from?
Well, I don't know how that relates to Africa.
Oh, okay. Basically, what I'm trying to point out is the concept of egalitarianism that Socrates and co wrote about, they got it from Egypt, from Africa.
No, that's not true.
It's very true.
There's a book by a classicist, Mary Lefkowitz, and it's called Not Out of Africa.
Right, and there's a book on Greek philosophy, which is stolen from Africa.
On what?
Greek philosophy.
But that's not my field of expertise. But
okay.
The scholars, Mary Lefkowitz, debunked that. That's just not true.
Okay, but there are some who are also debunking that idea of that. But let's leave that aside. The second point is you made reference to slavery still taking place in Africa now. I would just appreciate an example.
Eritrea. I have an example, and it was from 2018, and it was an article, I think, that was in The Guardian, which is a far-left British publication. And the man, he was a photographer, and he took a trip there. He was imprisoned for a while, and then he went and visited the camps. And so, from that article, I learned that it's basically the lighter-skinned Arabs who were enslaving the other Africans. And that's documented. I mean, there is still a fight. I mean, although it's, no, I'm sorry, it's not Eritrea, it's Mauritania. I'm sorry, Mauritania. Although I think it's officially outlawed, the government just, lets it go on.
Thank you very much.
Hi, Ben Herrick, first-year Smith Scholar, significantly underdressed. Anyway, so being an immigrant yourself, and then in the media, the typical Americans can sometimes be described as xenophobic or sexist. Have you ever felt difficulty in the intellectual and political world by being a female immigrant in the United States?
Well, people who don't agree with my political views have said that I may have some psychological problems because I was born, I'm crazy because, I was born in a communist country that's why I'm so hostile to communism. And so my opinion on that doesn't really matter because it's a kind of a weird logic. When I was growing up, I've been discriminated against because of my political views. I could have gotten all kinds of positions and grants if I were to take a sort of ideological line that was demanded. As an immigrant, my parents spoke broken English, and they tried to retain their old world ways as much as possible in Rochester, New York. My father and his brother, would split a hog, and we'd have the sausage making. He made his own wine. He even had a little still in the basement, which was completely illegal, to make slivovitza. And so, and the yard was full of fruit trees and grapevines, and, kids made fun of you back then. But it's, it's universal. We're all human beings, and there is a tendency to sort of exclude someone who's different. Where I really, think it's unfair is in academe, because I always saw school, at least back when I was going, in the early grades in the 60s, it was a place of order. And it was a place of reasoned discussion, and it was fair. If you knew how to do the math problems and you got them all correct, you were rewarded. We had spelling bees. It was competitive. And I really, really liked that, and I liked reading, and I liked contemplation and learning. And then when I got to graduate school in the 90s, I went back to school, it was like, wait a minute, truth is a Eurocentric idea. Well, if it's Eurocentric, then all the benefit to, Europe for bringing that. Because how else can people be treated fairly regardless of their ethnic background or, disabilities or whatever else? You treat everyone as a human being. And allow them to have their own ideas and their own opinions and to come to their conclusions and, discuss things in a reasonable manner. But that, I see that disappearing.
Hi. So I think we all probably know that there's been a lot of issues in America, and do you think that some of those can be attributed as the effects of this book that Zinn wrote, or
can what be attributed? I'm sorry.
Race relations in the United States and so on and so forth? Or do you think our generation is seeing effects from his education of children?
Yeah, I think this getting away from the idea of fairness and equality and unity as a nation is actually exacerbating, racial friction. It's not I don't think it's bringing people together, and Zinn does that. He has no respect for people who don't agree with him, and he makes people angry when they read his book, and the anger is directed at, Christopher Columbus. He was European, and all the Europeans are evil. And all the Native Americans are good and pure, childlike. Those are the worst kinds of stereotypes. And if you promote those enough and effectively enough, you get groups of people to hate other groups of people. And going back to the part of the world where I was born, that's been going on for centuries. I mean, we're unique in America where, the ideal is that you are rewarded based on merit, based on character. We don't live up to it all the time, but at least that's the ideal. It's not like, in Mauritania, you're born a slave, you accept it, and that's the way you're going to live. So and one of the reasons I write about this stuff, it just makes me scared to think, that, there's this instigation of a civil war, where people can't just, even go out to eat someplace, right, in peace and quiet, and, live next door as neighbors without, seeing each other as these specific stereotypes.
Hi, I'm Patrick.
Hi.
Thank you for coming in. You had talked about the New Deal as being some kind of like a cheap religion. Can you just elaborate more on that?
Oh, yeah. So H.L. Mencken, very sarcastic, satirical writer, but the thing about the New Deal is that, it was conducted as an article of faith. I mean, they didn't really know what they were doing, and, a lot of the ideas were just sort of trickled down from communism. We're going to, put these price controls here. We're going, one of the illogical things they did during the Great Depression was tell farmers to, slaughter their piglets, and then these families would be going hungry. But it was like, the brain trust, the people who had these ideas had never lived on a farm or done anything, so these were not tried and tested things, but they were just sort of cooked up. And so those who were promoting them sort of had a faith in it. And it's the same thing with Marxism. Reading Karl Marx makes no sense. You have to sort of say, yeah, I believe. And I think that's why so many of Zinn's adherents are so hard to convince. I mean, I tried to conduct a teacher workshop at the local Barnes & Noble near where I live, and this guy, we think he was a high school teacher, he came in and he was just like, he wouldn't let me get 3 words out and kept interrupting me. He didn't want to hear it. And so, when people attack me, like that professor at SUNY Geneseo, State University of New York, they won't tell me what I got wrong. It's just, they believe in what Zinn believes, that there is this group of oppressors and a group of oppressed, and there's no in between. It's black and white. And if you're on the side of righteousness in this holy war, you are going to oppose the American system. I mean, they may not think it out the way Zinn did, but there's this sort of emotional faith because it logically doesn't make any sense. That answer it?
Yeah. And do you see any similarities between, that attitude for the New Deal to the Green New Deal that's being proposed and talked about now?
Yes.
Okay. Can you talk about that? That's kind of really my question, I guess.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's, I don't know, one of the things, I consider myself to be an environmentalist. I mean, I'm not like a doctrinaire one way or the other. And I like the idea of organic farms. I like to go to my, local farmers market. But, with the new Green Deal, it's like it's going to be subsidized by tax dollars. And I'm all for, putting up solar panels on a house and stuff. But if it's going to work, then people would buy it. I think there are free market approaches to protecting the environment. And the Green New Deal is really, a socialist plan under the sort of the disguise of environmentalism. And I found this out a long time ago. I once went to a Green Party political meeting thinking that they're going to be talking about environmentalism. It was not that at all. It was Marxism. So there are other ways to protect the environment, and one of those ways I think is to not get so many products from China. So that would help.
Hi, I'm Johanna, and my question for you is, a lot of people today share Zinn's views, particularly with Christopher Columbus and the Native Americans, and I know you've mentioned that you've tried to talk to people and they haven't listened, so do you think that there is anything that could be done to undo his corruption, and if so, what?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. I want to remove Zinn's book from classrooms, and people will accuse me of censorship. I'm not saying it shouldn't be published, that people can't go out and buy it and read it for themselves, but there would be no book that is as factually wrong and deliberately wrong used at any other, used in classrooms. So I definitely think we need to, get Zinn out and to start teaching the story of Christopher Columbus in a great appropriate way, and again, to put what happened there into the context, present Columbus the way Morrison did, a man who did great things, not perfect. And I really do think, last week I met with this 81-year-old man from an Italian family in Syracuse. And, there have been 33 statues of Columbus torn down. And that's part of the whole effort to wipe out history. But this man, he's been working with the mayor, and he showed, I went there and I looked at this monument, and he explained it to me, and he described what had gone on. He said, my grandparents who were immigrants, and the others, as a source of pride when Italians were discriminated against, collected their pennies and nickels to put this up, and they brought it over from Italy in crates, and here are the photos. And he had tears in his eyes, So I think those need to be protected. We can't succumb to the mob. No matter what the mob is doing, we just can't function as a society that way. You can't, have just anarchy in the streets. I mean, that's happened before in history, and it has not turned out well.
Thank you. Mary Grabar, I want to thank you very much for a very stimulating and interesting talk.
Thanks for the
Professor Grabar
questions.
has agreed to stick around for a few minutes if you want her to sign a copy of your book. Thank you very much.
Thank you.